Florida was Spanish territory from 1513 to 1763, when it was transferred over to Britain after the American Revolution. It was transferred back to Spain until 1821, when Florida became a United States territory. Florida's population was always small during its entire time as Spanish and British territories. The British occupation saw a rise in the population, but it was short-lived. Most of the residents of Florida lived in and around St. Augustine on the East Coast and Pensacola in the Panhandle. There were other small towns along the King's Road and small forts over the years, as well as missions. The interior of Florida was sparsely populated by European settlers. This was the home of the Seminole Indians. There were a few plantations along the St. Johns River, and steamboat travel was well established along the St. Johns and Apalachicola rivers. By the 1830s, travel through the interior was very difficult and dangerous. Settlers coming into the interior of Florida were faced with the Seminole people. 3 wars were fought to remove the Seminoles and send them to Oklahoma, but a small band of a few hundred survived in the Florida Everglades. These wars lasted until the 1850s, which slowed development of the interior of Florida. Florida's population, 1840, had reached 54,477 people, with African American slaves making up nearly one half of that number. Florida became a state on March 3, 1845. Its population had reached 66,500. Around 30,000 of those were held in slavery. After statehood, the population started to boom. By 1861, the population had increased to 140,000. 63,000 of that number were enslaved people. Forced labor in Florida accounted for 85% of the state's cotton production, with the majority of plantations being concentrated in Middle Florida. Plantations trickled down into Central Florida. The further south, the fewer in number. South Florida was largely unpopulated, besides Key West. Tensions were rising in the South ahead of the 1860 election. In January 1860, talk of conflict had progressed so much that Senators Stephen Mallory and David Levy Ewell had requested munitions and equipment in Florida forts. Governor Perry sent a message to the state legislature on November 27, 1860, asking for $100,000 in funding for the state military, as well as a new militia law. They approved the funding, but did not enact any new militia laws. Perry took the $100,000 and bought arms in South Carolina. During the 1860 presidential election, Southern Democrats walked out of the Democratic National Convention. They nominated John C. Breckinridge to run for their party. Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, but Breckinridge won the vote in Florida. A few days after the election, a large group of pioneers headed to Ocala, Florida, and demanded secession. A special secession convention known as the Convention of the People of Florida was called by Governor Madison S. Perry to discuss secession from the Union. Delegates met on January 3, 1861 in Tallahassee, Florida. 51 of the 69 convention members held slaves, and just 7 of the members were Florida natives. On January 7th, the vote was a landslide in favor of secession, 62 for secession and 7 for staying in the Union. One individual who voted against secession was Richard Keith Call, a former Seminole War commander and conservative plantation owner. His daughter wrote that once he had been told the vote outcome by supporters who delivered it to his home, Call raised his cane above his head and told the delegates, "And what have you done? You have opened the gates of hell, from which shall flow the curses of the damned, which shall sink you to perdition." Anyone against secession were called names such as submissionists and Union shriekers. They faced public ridicule, and some were even attacked or killed. One example was William Hollingsworth, who was shot by a group of secessionists who called themselves regulators. January 8th, a formal ordinance of secession was introduced for debate to find out whether or not to secede immediately or wait until more states seceded from the Union first. On January 10, 1861, the delegates formally adopted the Ordinance of Secession, which declared that the nation of Florida had withdrawn from the American Union. Florida was the 3rd state to secede after South Carolina and Mississippi. The next month, 6 more states seceded. After secession was declared, a ceremony was held on the steps of the Florida Capitol, with fireworks and a parade. The secession ordinance only declared that it was severing ties with the federal union. It did not state any causes for secession. A new state constitution was adopted within a month and joined other states to form the Confederate States of America. In June 1861, the Confederate government split Florida up into military districts, led by Confederate commanders. They were given the power to requisition soldiers from the governor. In March 1862, the state convention abolished the state militia in order to create a more unified Confederate military. With a population of 140,000 and almost half of that number being enslaved, Florida did not have many men to give to the Confederacy to fight, compared to the other states in the Confederacy. And even some of the border states who had not seceded had more men join the Confederate Army than Florida did. Only around 16,000 were white males between the ages of 18 and 45 who were able for military service. Despite this, the state did raise around 15,000 troops for the Confederate Army. They were organized into 12 regiments of infantry, 2 cavalry, as well as several artillery batteries. Governor John Milton had stressed the importance of Florida as a supplier of goods rather than personnel. Florida was a large supplier of beef cattle for the Confederate Army. Governor Milton, as well as Confederate officials, urged many farmers to grow food instead of cotton and other cash crops. Despite this, many of the farmers continued to grow cash crops instead of food for the Confederate Army. The state had a long coastline which made it ideal for salt production. Many salt works were established on the coastlines, but most were on the Gulf Coast from Tampa Bay to the Panhandle. The U.S. Navy engaged in raiding operations throughout the war against the salt works. After the fall of Vicksburg, Florida became an even more important food source for the Confederacy. The Union forces operated a blockade around the entire state. With 8,436 miles of coastline and 11,000 miles of river and waterways, Florida became a haven for blockade runners. And this proved to be a daunting task for federal patrols. The close proximity of Cuba was used to continue trade with Spain and the rest of Europe, but Spain resisted in selling arms and ammunition, so they could remain as neutral as possible. But they did continue the exportation of cotton, as well as the importation of food, cigars, medical supplies, and army surplus shoes for the Confederacy. On February 14, 1861, the state legislature authorized Chapter 1097 of the Laws of Florida, which allowed the issuing of banknotes. But the notes did not start circulating until September and October of 1861. In 1861 and 1862, $500,000 was issued. $340,000 more in 1863. These denominations were issued $1, $2, $3, $5, $10, $20, $50, and $100. In 1862, the Florida House of Representatives established a Committee on Indian Affairs. This was an effort to improve relations with the Seminole Indians and prevent them from fighting on the side of the Union. Despite this, little was done to support the Seminoles. The Seminoles decided to remain officially neutral throughout the entire conflict. Despite this, some did sign to fight for the Confederacy, but others, including Billy Bowlegs, fought for the Union. The governor worked to strengthen the state's militia and improve fortifications and defensive positions. Confederate forces quickly seized control of many U.S. forts. They succeeded in most cases, with the exception of Fort Jefferson, Fort Pickens, and Fort Zachary Taylor. They stayed in federal control throughout the war. State troops seized the federal arsenal in Chattahoochee on January 6, 1861, the day after Florida seceded from the Union. Union General Adam J. Sleemer destroyed 20,000 pounds of gunpowder at Fort McCree. He then spiked the guns at Fort Barracas, disabling them and moving his forces to Fort Pickens. The majority of Florida military units were sent off to fight in the Eastern Theater. The 2nd, 5th, and 8th Florida Infantries. They served under Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. They fought at 2nd Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. There were a number of engagements in Florida during the Civil War, with one major battle, the first land engagement in Northeast Florida, and the first Confederate victory in Florida. This was the skirmish of the Brick Church. After Confederates heard that federal forces landed in Jacksonville, Colonel Davis sent a detachment of cavalry to Camp Langford near Jacksonville. Scouts reported that the Federals had established a strong picket outside a brick church. Colonel Dilworth would do a hit-and-run raid, and Lieutenant Strange of the 3rd Florida was ordered to capture the Federals if possible with no bloodshed. 30 Confederates encountered 5 Federal troops around the brick church. The Union soldiers were hiding behind tombstones, trees, and the churchyard, firing on the advancing Confederate troops. The Union soldiers were forced to retreat inside the church. The Confederates stormed the church, 2 Union soldiers were killed, and the 3 remaining surrendered. When the Confederates advanced on the main force of Union soldiers, the Confederates were halted by return fire, with 1 dead officer and 2 soldiers taken prisoner. After this, the Union troops retreated to their ships in Jacksonville, and they torched the city. The site of the church has never been found, but the cemetery remains. On June 30th, the USS Sagamore, a Union gunboat, came into Tampa Bay. She opened her gun ports and turned her broadside on the town. A small boat with 20 men was launched, flying a flag of truce. In a post-action report, Captain John William Pearson, CSA, wrote a report to General Joseph Finnegan, CSA, what transpired. I immediately manned one of my boats with 18 men, met them in the bay, determined they should not land on my shore, and on meeting the boat, the lieutenant in command reported that he had been sent to demand an unconditional surrender of the town. My reply to him was that we did not understand the meaning of the word surrender. There was no such letter in our book. We don't surrender. He then said they would commence shelling the town at 6 o'clock, and I told him to pitch in. We then gave 3 hearty cheers for the Southern Confederacy, and the Federal boat crew said nothing. At 6 o'clock, they promptly opened fire on us with heavy shells and shot. After 2 from them, we opened up our batteries, consisting of 3 24-pound cannon. Both parties then kept up a regular gunfire until 7 p.m. At that point, USS Sagamore withdrew. On July 1st, between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m., the gunboat fired from beyond range of the Confederate cannon. After a 2-hour break for lunch, the USS Sagamore fired 2 more rounds, weighed anchor, and sailed away. There were no Confederate casualties. The Battle of Fort Brooke was an even more significant action fought in Tampa. Captain A.A. Semmes, a commander of Union naval forces of Florida's west coast, having decided to mount an operation to end blockade running out of Tampa. 2 Union gunships, USS Tahoma and USS Adela, sailed into Tampa Bay on October 16, 1863, and began a slow bombardment of Fort Brooke, while staying at a range of the fort's artillery batteries. 2 days later, a Union raiding party under Acting Master T.R. Harris disembarked at Ballast Point Landing, near the current intersection of Bayshore Boulevard and Gandy Boulevard. While the gunships continued their bombardment, about 100 Union troops marched 14 miles north through a wooded area. Their target was the Jean Street shipyard on the Hillsborough River. After reaching their target, they quickly seized and burned ships moored at the dock, including 2 notorious blockade runners, the steamship Scottish Chief and the sloop Kate Dale. The ships and the shipyard were owned by James McKay. He escaped capture by the attackers, along with some crew members, and they sped towards the town and warned the Confederate forces at Fort Brooke about the raid. The 2nd Florida Infantry Battalion, along with the Ocklawaha Rangers cavalry unit and some citizens, gave chase. They caught up with them at the landing point on Tampa Bay. An engagement known as the Battle of Ballast Point ensued as the Union troops attempted to board their dinghies, with covering fire from the Tahoma and the Adelia directed at the Confederate forces. The raiding party reached the ship after suffering 16 casualties. The Union forces sailed out of Tampa Bay soon after. The raid was a success. When Union forces returned in May 1864, Fort Brooke was no longer garrisoned, and the town had been virtually abandoned. Cannons and supplies at the fort were destroyed, and after a short occupation, the Union troops left the area. The Battle of Olustee was the only major battle fought in Florida. On January 13, 1864, President Lincoln wrote Major General Quincy A. Gilmore, commander of the Union's Department of the South. He asked that he take steps to reconstruct a loyal state government in Florida by the following month. Gilmore ordered an expedition into Florida to secure Union enclaves, sever Confederate supply routes, and recruit African American soldiers. Brigadier General Truman Seymour, who commanded the expedition, landed at Jacksonville with his troops in an area that had already been seized by the Union in March of 1862. Several raids were made into the northeast and north central Florida areas. He met little resistance during these raids. He seized several Confederate camps, captured small bands of troops and artillery pieces, and liberated slaves. But he was under orders from Gilmore not to advance deep into the state. Seymour's preparations in South Carolina concerned the Confederate Command General P.G.T. Beauregard, guessing that their objective was Florida and that he posed a threat to him. So he detached a force to reinforce Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan. While this was going on, Seymour, without Gilmore knowing his plans, began a new drive across North Florida to capture the Florida capital of Tallahassee. Seymour's force of 5,500 men followed the Florida and Atlantic, Gulf, and Central Railroad towards Lake City. At around 2:30 on February 20th, Union forces approached General Finnegan's 5,000 Confederates entrenched near Olustee Station. Finnegan set out an infantry brigade to meet Seymour's advancing troops and lure them into the Confederate entrenchments. The opposing forces met at Ocean Pond, and a battle began. Seymour made the mistake by assuming that he was facing militia troops, the same kind he had easily routed in skirmishes. He sent his troops in piecemeal. Both Finnegan and Seymour reinforced their engaging units. The battle took place in an open pine wood. The Union forces attacked, but were routed by rifle and cannon fire on the Confederate side. The battle continued throughout the afternoon. Then Finnegan committed his final reserves. The Union line broke, and they began to retreat. Finnegan did not exploit this. He allowed most of the Union forces to reach Jacksonville. The Confederates did make one final attempt to engage the rear element of Seymour's forces just before nightfall, but they were repulsed by the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment and the 35th United States Colored Troops. Both of these units were composed of African American soldiers. Union casualties were 203 killed, 1,152 wounded, and 506 missing. They lost 6 artillery pieces and had 39 horses captured. A total of 1,861 casualties, about 34% of the Union forces. Confederate losses were lower. 93 killed, 847 wounded, and 6 missing. A total of 946 casualties. Still about 19% of the Confederate forces. This ratio of Union casualties made it the second bloodiest battle of the war per capita for the Union, with 265 casualties per 1,000 troops. There were men on both sides that were veterans of large battles in the eastern and western theaters of war. Many of them remarked in letters and diaries that they had never undergone such terrible fighting. Union losses caused Northern authorities to question the necessity of further involvement in military actions against the insignificant state of Florida in their minds. On the morning of February 22nd, the Union forces were still retreating to Jacksonville. The 54th Massachusetts was ordered to counter-march back to 10 Mile Station. A locomotive had broken down that was carrying wounded soldiers, and it was in danger of being captured. When they arrived, the men attached ropes to the engine and cars and manually pulled the train around 3 miles to Camp Finnegan. When horses were attached to help pull the train the total distance of 10 miles. It took them 42 hours to pull the train to Jacksonville. For the South, this battle raised their spirits. The Confederates were suffering greatly at this time during the war, and the battle was undeniably a Confederate victory. In March of 1864, Palatka was occupied, a town in the interior of Florida along the St. Johns River. There were 2 picket attacks later that month. The first mine casualty of the war was the Maple Leaf at Jacksonville on April 1st, 1864. The General Hunter was also sunk close to where the Maple Leaf was sunk. May 19th, there was a skirmish with the 17th Connecticut in Wallacca, Florida, and a skirmish in Saunders. May 23rd, 1864, Captain John Jackson Dixon, with men from the 2nd Florida Cavalry and a battery from the Milton Light Artillery, captured the Federal gunboat Columbine. At the time, Union forces controlled the land east of the St. Johns River. Dixon had made several raids across the river, capturing 2 outposts. Hoping to trap the Confederates on the east side of the river, Union ground troops moved towards Wallacca, and the Columbine was sent upriver. But Dixon had already crossed the river and set up an ambush at Horse Landing. There was a channel and current which would bring the boat within 60 yards offshore. The Columbine was described at 117 feet in length. She returned fire but was disabled and surrendered. All 3 of her crew and the army troops on board were captured or killed. There were no Confederate casualties. After removing all the valuable supplies and armaments, the Columbine was burned and sunk. It is the only known cavalry unit to ever sink an enemy gunboat. Dixon was known in the South as the Swamp Fox. In the North, he was referred to as Dixie, and the land west of the river was Dixie's Land. April 2nd, New York's 14th Cavalry lost a skirmish at Cow Ford Creek. The 7th United States Colored Infantry fought in a skirmish at Camp Finnegan on May 25th. That same day, there was a skirmish at Jackson's Bridge near Pensacola. On February 14, 1864, about 50 Union troops entered Gainesville, intending to capture 2 trains. Company H of the 2nd Florida Cavalry, with 130 men, attempted to repulse the raid, but were defeated by Union forces, which successfully returned to Jacksonville after holding the town. On August 15th, Colonel Andrew Harris of the 75th Ohio Mounted Infantry left Baldwin, Florida, with 173 officers and men from the 75th Ohio Voluntary Infantry. The Union troops destroyed a picket post on the New River at Start, and they were joined by the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry and some Florida Unionists. They reached Gainesville on August 17th to find the town occupied by a company of the 2nd Florida Cavalry. The battle took place this day in the town square. They were attacked by the rear from the soldiers of the 2nd Florida Cavalry under command of Captain John Jackson Dixon, supported by local militia, elements of the 5th Florida Cavalry Battalion, and a small artillery battery of 2 cannons. Dixon's men numbered about 290, although only 175 entered Gainesville and engaged in the fighting. The Union were taken by surprise and had not fully deployed when the Confederate attack began. After 2 hours, Colonel Harris gave the order to retreat from Gainesville. The Confederates continued to close in on the disorganized Union columns. Union losses numbered 28 dead, 5 wounded, 86 missing or unaccounted for, 188 captured, 260 horses, and a 12-pound howitzer. Confederate losses were 3 killed and 5 wounded. 2 of the wounded died the next day. About 40 Union troops, including Colonel Harris, escaped. He reported his column was destroyed by a large Confederate force of 600 to 800 and 3 cannons. After hearing this lie, the remaining Union forces in north central Florida withdrew to the garrisons of Jacksonville and St. Augustine. Gainesville remained in Confederate control for the duration of the war. September 27, 1864, General Alexander Asboth led a raid on Marianna, Florida, the home of Governor Milton, and an important supply depot, as well as a recruitment and mustering center for Confederate militia and reserves. In 1864, it was the largest northwest Florida town besides Tallahassee, still in Confederate hands. A raid in July 1864 revealed the region's potential vulnerability to a large expedition. September 18, 1864, a column of 700 Union troops under Brigadier General Alexander Asboth set out from Fort Broncos. They rode east through the northwest region of Florida. The local Florida cavalry was spread thinly and unable to provide an appropriate warning of the size, location, and approach of the raiders. Confederate Commander Alexander B. Montgomery was left to guess the Federal objective, as well as to the strength of the Union raiders. This led to a delay in calling up the reserves. As the raiders progressed, the Union cavalry fanned out, destroying and confiscating local foods and supplies. Asboth sent a detachment to destroy the Douglas Ferry, in order to disguise his intentions, which was the direct route to Marianna. He then took an alternate route which would take the expedition northwest of Marianna. On September 26, 1864, his mounted troopers skirmished with Captain Alexander Goodwin's cavalry around Campbellton. The Union troops were now less than 20 miles from their target. His men rested in preparation for the fight at Marianna the next day. Colonel Montgomery still delayed in calling up the home guard for the reserves. The next morning, the Federal raiders progressed towards the town. They passed the old fort crossroads, and then Colonel Montgomery was certain of their destination. He called out the home guard and assembled what reserves he had available. Montgomery's cavalry contested the crossing of Hopkins Branch, 3 miles from the town, with the intention of falling back into the town via the old bypass, rather than the main road. In the town, Montgomery deployed conscripts, militia, and the home guard in an ambush along the main road. As his skirmishers at Hopkins Branch withdrew along the bypass, the home guard waited behind fences and crude barricades of wagons and carts. Asboth divided his forces and led the main contingent heading on a charge down the main road. Another portion of his force went around the bypass along the route Montgomery's cavalry had taken. Seeing this, and realizing that his whole force could be trapped, Montgomery tried to pull back, but it was too late. Asboth was unaware of what awaited him. They rounded the corner straight into the volley of fire by the home guard. Asboth was wounded, and he lost many of the senior officers in the volley. Despite this, the Union cavalry rapidly overwhelmed the Confederate cavalry, pushing down the road in pursuit. As the flanking force swept in from behind, many rebel troopers were able to push their way past the Union flanking force and escaped. But the home guard, conscripts, and militia were pinned down in town. Colonel Montgomery was captured attempting to flee. His cavalry took up positions on the other shore and were able to deter the Union forces from crossing the bridge. In the town, the remaining defenders on the south side of the street broke up and ran, but those near the church held out as a detachment of U.S. colored troops engaged them. A dismounted bayonet charge finally forced their surrender. However, several Confederates continued to fire from the church and nearby homes. This led to the church being torched, and the defenders were shot down as they came rushing out of the smoke-filled church. When the fighting ended, 10 Confederates lay dead, 16 wounded, 54 were captured, with 13 of those being released later. Union casualties were 8 killed, 19 wounded, and 10 captured. Among the Federal wounded was General Asboth himself. In Cedar Key, there was the Battle of Station 4. The Union column reached Station 4 at 3 p.m. on Sunday, February 12, 1865. Captain Dixon's Confederates were approaching. He led them forward to form a battle line of 120 men. On Monday, February 13th, the Federals saw the Confederates coming and opened fire. 30 Union soldiers, along with Lieutenant Pace, used the railroad embankment as a breastworks, but the rest of the Union forces retreated. Dixon stated that he withdrew due to ammunition shortages after killing or wounding 70 men, and that the rest of the Federals left in the battle. Confederate losses were reported as 5 men wounded, although this was adjusted in a later account to 6 men. Dixon was able to recapture cattle, horses, and wagons that had been stolen during the Union raid. But the Union tell a different story of the account of this battle. They account for 5 killed, 17 wounded, and 3 captured. This raid led to the Battle of Natural Bridge. Union Brigadier General John Newton had undertaken a joint force to destroy Confederate supplies and engage troops that had attacked Cedar Key and Fort Myers, and that they were somewhere around St. Mark's. The Navy had trouble getting its ships up the St. Mark's River. The Union Army had advanced, and after finding one bridge destroyed, it started before dawn, March 6th, to attempt to cross the river at Natural Bridge. The Union troops initially pushed rebel forces back, but not away from the bridge. Sailors from the USS Hendricks Hudson also participated and were awarded the Medal of Honor. Confederate forces were protected by breastworks, guarded all the approaches of the bridge itself. The battle lasted most of the day, unable to take the bridge. The Union troops retreated to the protection of the fleet. Union troops had a total of 700 men, suffered 21 killed 89 wounded, and 38 captured. Confederate troops had a total of 1,000 men, had 3 killed and 23 wounded. There were numerous skirmishes all throughout Florida. Florida is not well known for its involvement in the American Civil War, but it played an important role in the war with supplies, and its vast coastline provided a safer way for trading with other nations. The cattle and salt in Florida helped feed the soldiers, and thousands of Floridians fought and died in the American Civil War. And yes, Florida is very often overlooked of its importance during the Civil War. There weren't that many soldiers. Hell, there was like over 30,000 Confederate troops that fought from Maryland, and Maryland was a border town. It didn't even secede from the Union, and there was only around 16,000 from Florida, so double that. For a huge state such as Florida, for a tiny little state such as Maryland, it's kind of unbelievable. The population did not boom really in Florida until the 1890s. After the Civil War with Reconstruction, things were very slow. A lot of people fled. It wasn't until later, like when Northerners started coming down after the Reconstruction period into Florida, and the railroads were built. There was only a total during the American Civil War of like 2 railroads in the entire state of Florida. You had one going from Jacksonville to Tallahassee, and you had another one going from Jacksonville to Cedar Key. Very sparsely populated, a high number of slaves compared to the number of civilians. But Florida did have a whole lot of action down here. Most of it was small. There was a lot of skirmishes. If you actually look at a detailed map of every engagement and everything that happened in Florida, there was something happening like every couple days down here. It was just a small number. A lot of stuff out on the waterways in the ocean with a lot of blockade runners. Something was always popping off out in the coast. But yes, Florida was the breadbasket for the Confederacy. We had a lot of cattle. We still have a lot of cattle today, but there was a ton of cattle back in the day. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about what is often not told, the American Civil War in Florida. What led up to it, what happened, when, where, and all the stuff that went on. There's a lot that I missed during this, but I didn't want to have a 3-hour video of every single solitary little skirmish and engagement. I went over the more well-known ones, and there's still a lot more. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you liked. Please leave a comment. Comments, criticisms, they're always enjoyed. Just put a comment anywhere down below. It really helps me out, no matter what you say. If you comment, it's going to get our videos pushed out there more. So I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.